Yeah, Sol's in a really interesting chart, right? So it had such incredible momentum here. And again, to me, this area becomes really key. I actually think Solana has a very, very rosy future. Saw that 20% correction on Bitcoin right here where we had the fall after the spot ETF. That was kind of the letdown, right? The big news came out. Everyone said, okay. And then we saw GBTC having to unload a ton of their Bitcoin, which obviously put a damper on what was going into the other ETFs at the time. But that has now subsided. And we're seeing this resurgence where you have a risk on environment in the stock market, new all-time highs. And Bitcoin obviously is a recipient of risk on as a risk asset. So I think as long as we see that risk on narrative in the markets continue, then Bitcoin can continue to go up. Now, I am dabbling up in this range. You can see the trend line I have here on a little bit of a short. But again, remember, for everyone out there watching, I'm a swing trader. So, we get a $5,000 pullback or a $3,000 pullback. I take my profits. I potentially even go long at the right levels. But again, I would say that, again, this move on Bitcoin is going to continue generally unless the stock market starts to really pull back. If you get a 20-30% pullback in the stock market, I would generally think that Bitcoin could be back at 30 to 32,000 from those current levels. No, and BlackRock, to be fair, I mean, their goal is to build this ETF where it's very profitable for them, right? I mean, that's the underlying narrative. You have to wonder if Larry Fink is really, does he really believe in Bitcoin, or he's just talking his book at this point as well. But I think that you're right. I mean, the longer term is, there's no doubt in my mind that Bitcoin goes up over the longer term. The scarcity aspect, the halvings, all these different factors, including the ability for regular folk to get in on the spot ETF and not risk getting their funds stolen out of an exchange that doesn't have FDIC insurance. So those are all positive narratives. But I also do worry that, if we look back in Bitcoin had, out of the last, let's see, let me put up my chart here so we can see exactly. So out of the last 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 days, Bitcoin was up every day except for the day that the stock market sold off. All right. So what that tells me is that there's still some factor there that is a risk asset in it. Now, again, does that slowly shift? Yes. In fact, I think it's already shifting. But I still think if you get panic in the equity markets, it would be hard to imagine that you wouldn't see a spillover into crypto just a little bit, especially the altcoins. I think the altcoins are more vulnerable than Bitcoin. But I do think at least you could see a potential spillover where you do see some sort of good solid pullback in Bitcoin. So just looking at the charts here, a few things that kind of pique my interest. So what we're looking at, we have a top here at 186 on the chart. That's your resistance level. And we're getting very, very close to it, right? We're at 167 today. So that's a positive. Look at how the low on Coinbase right here, look at how it basically aligned right with this former high. And again, that's the chart beauty. I love stuff like that, how it shows you that was support and it actually held beautifully in terms of the bounce to the upside. Now, my only caveat to this is that, okay, so I think Coinbase has a great business model, but does the spot ETF, as it becomes more and more popular, do people start moving towards that, or do they still open Coinbase accounts? And again, I don't know the answer to that, but that would be something that I'd be concerned with. Also, fees, right? We know what the ETFs are charging. They're charging, 0.25% on the fees in their ETFs. But if you go and make a purchase on Coinbase, I believe the fees are much, much higher. And does that then cause those fees, right? So eventually Coinbase is going to have to compete to get dollars and dollars to get turned into Bitcoin. Does that force their margins down significantly on the chart or on the price action, which would then cause the chart to fall based on valuation? So again, these are all question marks in my mind, right? Yeah, so right now I'm looking at that 52K area as being very significant on the Bitcoin chart, and flipping over to the chart again. So this trend line is a big one for me, kind of keeping an eye on this 52. We almost touched 53,000 today. I want to see if this line can get broken. If we break this line at 52.5 to 53, 57 is probably your next big target zone on Bitcoin. So I think that would be something to keep an eye on. But you brought up Ethereum, and let's take a look at that chart, because you've had this beautiful long-term channel on Ethereum, right? So, and I can even get rid of some of these lines to just kind of show the beauty of it. But this goes back all the way to 2022, the lows, and you could see the highs, and these two lines are perfectly parallel. The kicker here is that Ethereum is beginning to push above that range. And again, above this range, if we can hold above, let's say for 2 or 3 days here, I think you probably head towards 3,000 on the Ethereum chart, and then potentially even higher. And I think I saw one of your potential targets was like 3,500. That would be this pivot high at just above 3,500, and that's not out of the realm for Ethereum in terms of playing catch up to what we've seen out of Bitcoin and some alts. I mean, again, if you look at the runs in Solana or some of these other ones, really Ethereum has lagged substantially on that percentage type move. So it's definitely a possibility that this is going to catch fire. The other thing I'll say too is if we start hearing that narrative of spot ETF again, that would be another catalyst for Ethereum here in the near term. Yeah, Sol's in a really interesting chart, right? So it had such incredible momentum here. This is my favorite trend line on Solana, right? It goes back to October of 2023. And what we see is the price deviates and gets above and then comes back, gets above, comes back, continues to kind of retest this upsloping trend line, but doesn't bounce until that final blow off top here. And then we came down, we hit the line a few times from the other side, but then broke through. But look at what's happening now. As we come up, we hit that line, pulled back, hit it here, pause, pierced it yesterday, but now we're seeing a little bit of a sell-off today. So again, as this line goes up, you're starting to get closer to that high, that 52-week high. And again, to me, this area becomes really key. If it can't really get above this upsloping trend line, it's vulnerable. At least, and we're talking near term here. I actually think Solana has a very, very rosy future, but just in terms of near term price action, this area right here, which is currently around 116, is huge for Solana. If it gets through 116, it should retest 126. And then that's the question, can it break through that level if it retests that 126 level? One of the things we saw was this beautiful channel that we kept on, jumping from highs to lows. But look, we've now taken out that channel to the upside and are now consolidating a little bit. So as long as we stay above this line, you would continue to have a bullish bias on this chart. The one thing I would look at here is what's called a measured move on the move price, right? So if we take this low here to this high, we get about a $9.30 move, $9.40 move. And the idea is if we continue up, where does that take us? And it would take us right up to, and I might see if I can get up that high on this chart, and I'll have to shrink it down a little bit. But this would take us to about $22 to $23 as a target price. So I do think that as long as you stay above this yellow line, I think you continue to keep that bullish bias within the scope of Chainlink. But then if it gets to about 22 to 23, that might be an exhaustion level per the chart. Yeah, the chart is starting to show a little bit of a bullish bias here, right? So we've continued to move up here. We can see, again, we've kind of had that same sort of sideways chop of consolidation. There was even a head and shoulders here, but it never really triggered before starting to move back to the upside. The only thing I would just mention to traders, so there's a couple levels. We obviously have the recent high up here around $1.05 to $1.07. That's going to be resistance, right? That's a place where there were a lot of buyers coming in. They thought this thing was going to go parabolic when Solana was going parabolic, and then they kind of got left holding the bag. So there will be some sellers up in that range. But the other level to just keep an eye on here is this level here. Notice this high is essentially equal to this, which is equal to that. So to get to that high of 105 to 107, we have to get through the 95 level right here. And that'll be the level to watch now in the coming days as the bullishness continues to kind of permeate crypto. Can it get to 95? And if it gets to 95, can it push through? Then you have that shot of retesting the 52-week high over here and potentially breaking out. I am very concerned about how thin the leadership has become. In fact, interestingly enough, we can see number one, this is the S&P 500 chart, and look at kind of how we're just getting tighter and tighter in this little wedge pattern. And again, that wedge pattern goes all the way back to basically the beginning of 2023. And so one of the things you have to be careful of is, right now you're in a safe zone. This zone is safe between these two lines. But if we were to break below, that would start kickstarting algorithmic selling in the markets and also just people starting to take profits. And you could start to see a bigger pullback off of this level. On the other hand, if we break above this level, then you could get another leg up in the markets. But one of the concerns I have is that we have Apple even starting to not be a leader anymore, right? If we look at Apple, Apple's on this very pivotal technical trend line. If we zoom out, this goes back to 2023's low. And if this starts to break down, I mean, all of a sudden we've seen Microsoft still hitting new all-time highs, NVIDIA hitting new all-time highs, but some of the other big Magnificent Seven are not leading anymore. And if you look outside of that box, it's even thinner. You know, how many of the index or of the sectors within the S&P are even at new all-time highs? There's only one, which is the technology sector. So these are the types of things that keep me up at night in terms of the markets and saying, you know, let's be careful here. So looking at the Tesla chart, I mean, we've had this beautiful channel to the downside, right? So you take the highs and connect the highs and then a perfectly parallel line. And so really, once we hit this low end, you expected a bounce. We have seen that bounce, at least on a very short-term basis. I expect us to go further to the upside to at least around 207 to 208. But again, I think you have to look at the bigger macro picture, which is China's in a big world of trouble right now. I'm sure you've covered all the stats coming out of there, how bad that economy is. And the question is, can the U.S. continue to stay strong enough to offset the issues here? One of the things I like to point out is if you look back here, the chart on Tesla back in 2020 and 2021 was basically, in my opinion, very much what we're seeing out of NVIDIA. But I do wonder, you know, there's hundreds of semiconductor companies that are eagerly waiting or going into production on AI chips. And you do have to wonder if the chips will become commoditized and profit margins will really start to slip. So